Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to another Horus Heresy lore breakdown, Part 4 of the first Heretic. A fat little bastard to unravel, to be absolutely certain. We start with Lorgar's arrival at Colchis, which gives us a few hints into the planet's past. Apparently, it was once a fairly high-tech society that might even have had elements of full-on automation. Though that time has long since been past, and nobody really knew what brought down that ancient empire. Though, judging by the religion that overtook it, I think the answer is probably quite clear. We also get another insight into just how much the Emperor was really coddling Lorgar. Colchis has resisted all efforts to turn it into a resupply station, or even just truly an imperial outpost in reality. It is not used for supplies, it is not used for stockpiles, or military shipyards, or anything else. The only concession that Colchis has made is to allow the Adeptus Mechanicus to pilfer the various wrecks still in orbit around the planet. This is extraordinarily unusual. For a planet to be allowed to simply just exist in the state in which it was found is almost, although not entirely, unheard of. Whilst the Imperium consists of hundreds of thousands of worlds, allowing even one of those worlds' resources and capabilities to go completely untapped is exceedingly rare. Especially during the time of the Great Crusade, when all of the Imperium's efforts are focused into the singular focus of conquering the galaxy. And apparently, this was done by Lorgar's request. Lorgar apparently having asked the Emperor, although he has not confirmed that he wanted Colchis to be left alone. And this could also go, at least partially, towards explaining why the Emperor did not notice that Colchis' old religion was clearly heretical in nature, the fact that not that much archiving was really done. Now, of course, we don't know precisely how in-depth the Imperium went into figuring out Colchis' past, but we do know that Imperial researchers were at the very least allowed down to the planet to catalogue local wildlife, flora and fauna and such on, so they clearly did have access to it, though we do not necessarily know how much. We do know, however, that this was a pretty big deal. For the Emperor to simply allow his son to maintain his world in the old way, whilst still providing Imperial technology and aid to that world, is quite a grand gesture, and shows us again just how much the Emperor must have valued Lorgar. And speaking of valued, Lorgar's most valued counsel, after his rebuke, was waiting for him in orbit around Colchis. Magnus the Red, because Lorgar supposed, and correctly so, that if anybody would know where to go looking for gods, it probably would be Magnus. And I mean, what could possibly go wrong from putting those two in a room together? Magnus, who is utterly convinced that the Immaterium is nothing more than a force of nature we have yet to fully understand, and Lorgar, desperately seeking for something to place above himself. They've practically got the same goals. But before that, the return of the Legion is, of course, met with much rejoicing and happiness. Amusingly enough, apparently Colchis has received the news that the Legions was kneeling, etc., that the Emperor went, no, don't worship me, it's pretty dumb. And yet they too are still gripped in the very same religious fever. Huh. Does absolutely nobody listen to the Emperor in this bloody galaxy? I can kind of understand the word-bearers, because, as we will later know, they are somewhat more affected by Lorgar than most Legionnaires, but I mean, these guys are just the mortal populace of this planet, right? Even Cyrene is saying that, she knew the text, but she doesn't know if she really believed, and yet this planet appears to be as fervently religious as ever, to the point that the 7 survivors, 7, coinky-dink, I'm sure, are revered as living saints, and thousands of people meet up at the airports. How the fuck civilians make it into a military airport like that, I don't know, but hey, details, and mob them, seeking their blessing, etc. Argeltal tries to explain this away by saying that the survivors have become icons of Monarchia's fall, that they have become martyrs in life rather than in death. Which makes a degree of sense, but only if we continued to assume that this was a world still trapped in the grips of religion. Except, as we've already been told, Monarchia knows that the God Emperor has denounced the entire religion, which you would think would cause a few questions, but no. Instead, there are adoring hordes of worshippers mobbing them at the airport. There's still a religious class in place. They've got their churches. People still seem to believe. There's no sign of major upheaval, civil war in the bloody streets. You would think that blood would flow in rivers when people were told that their own god, their literal god, has denied one of the fundamental aspects of their reality. But there's just nothing. The characters keep saying that, oh, we were in error and we've been shown that, but there is no sign whatsoever that they are in any way reacting to this, that they are changing their ways, that they're doing anything differently. Hell, they're still using the same vocabulary, heretics and so on. Maybe I'm just having a problem placing myself in the religious mindset, and, well, shock may be a part of it, that people are so shocked that they can't really react. They can't understand what has happened, and so they just keep going in their day-to-day routines. But I don't feel like this would be that kind of shock, This should be a crisis of faith, shouldn't it? And I can understand the word bearers, because they are affected by Lorgar, but just the civilian populace showing no real sign of change. It's just so strange to me. I guess you could potentially make the argument that they are clinging to these 7 as, how do I put it, a relic of the bygone age? Hoping that if they can cling tightly enough to them, then that will mean that the age has not passed them by yet, but seems too speculative, really. I could even make an equally convincing argument that the Colchisians should be wanting to carry them out into the streets and disembowel them, as they would be living, breathing reminders of their failure, their censor, and their mistakes. But, well, I don't claim to be a religious expert, so maybe this is normal. I doubt it, but benefit of the doubt and all that. And coming up next is a conversation between Lorgar and Magnus, which is quite the fascinating little thing, both in regards to Lorgar and Magnus. Indeed, Magnus starts out with quite the gem, when he tells Lorgar that Lorgar is too humble, too selfless, and says, "If all you do is raise others from ignorance, when is the time for you to learn more yourself?" That is quite rich coming from Magnus the Red, who thought he knew better than literally everybody else, and was willing to go to pretty much any length to prove it, leading to his ultimate downfall. The two are also standing on a balcony when they see a huge parade of people in the distance, which they assume is the parade for the Blessed Lady, their new name for Cyrene, as she is apparently valued above all the other refugees. And Lorgar is quite woke on the woman's question, stating that, well, she's the only female and she is kinda hot, so makes sense that they would all flock to her. Which is a oddly dismissive thing for Lorgar to say, and Magnus picks up on it too and points out that he hears Corferon's calculations in his voice, and even warns Lorgar about listening to him too closely. Well, Magnus is forever blind to his own errors, but he is uncannily sharp in picking out others' weaknesses, isn't he? But Lorgar just kinda waves it away and says that Corferon's only real problem is that he worries that he's not worthy, and so he occasionally goes a little bit above and beyond to prove that he is. Well, I mean, that's not a terrible theory for somebody raised up to be a false Astartes. They do tend to have a little bit of a smaller dick syndrome, shall we say. Though in the case of Corferon, I don't think it's the size of his augmented winky he worries about, more so about how much larger and spikier he can potentially make it. And speaking of nightmares of large and spiky things, we get some really cool insight into Lorgar here, as he opens up to Magnus, by far the closest of all of his brothers. In fact, almost the only one he really respects, with the exception of Horus. Lorgar had nightmares from a very early age, which he later came to recognize as psychic premonitions, although the way in which he describes them suggests that they were not at all pleasant affairs, and that he would awake with blood running from his nose and the image of the Emperor burned into his mind, and he describes them as nightmares. What was it? At 8 years old, he was shocked to learn that other people have pleasant dreams. Which is quite interesting. So his nightmarish visions, which he later learned to be psychic powers, revolved around the Emperor. And Lorgar decided to worship the Emperor as a deity. Honestly, it kind of sounds like he should have been scared shitless of him, and instead of conquering the planet to welcome him, should be unifying it precisely to resist the coming of this nightmarish being. The reason why Lorgar came to worship the Emperor is something I would love to actually see explored a little bit more, because right after this he says, well, when the Emperor arrived, I expected him to be a luminous being that would bring meaning to all of human existence, which sounds like quite the bloody leap. I don't know if Lorgar truly believed that, because when the Emperor finally arrives, and he isn't the answer to all of humanity's questions, apparently, Lorgar is disappointed, and says that when the Emperor arrives and saw the oceans of blood spilled in his name, he simply didn't care. And Lorgar seems very hurt by this, as if he was expecting the Emperor to validate his actions. Look, I was right to lead this civil war because he truly is the answer to all of our questions. And of course, this kind of conflates with his previous explanation to Corferon and Erebus, when he said that he viewed the Emperor as a luminous being of infinite mercy and so on, and yet now he's talking to Magnus and telling him about how the Emperor is hollow, a being incapable of trust, and how he hates that about him. His tune sure has changed drastically. And he also points out that the Emperor apparently didn't tell them about this for the 100 years that they had been campaigning already. Which, to be fair, that is a big plot point, though he has been told. And what Lorgar says here, that he had no idea the Emperor felt this way, that is not correct. Because worship in an organized fashion, and hell, religion itself, has been outlawed in the Imperium for absolute ages. Indeed, the imperial truth, which outright rejects any and all forms of religion, has been the fundament of the Crusade from its very beginning. Lorgar even goes on to present a complete catch-22 when he says, only the truly divine deny their divinity. And then he says the Emperor never denied his divinity whilst there were weeks of celebrations in his name on Colchis. So either the Emperor denies that he is a god, and then that becomes evidence that he is a god, or he doesn't deny that he is a god, and Lorgar simply goes on to assume that he's a god regardless. And we've already spoken about the whole Colchisian thing. The Emperor wouldn't have outright rebuked a son that had done so much for him without even understanding it. Lorgar had outright rejected the chaotic religion of the planet and wiped it off the face of that very world. And the Emperor would not then go like, no, son, this is silly willy. Just like he wouldn't arrive on Fenris and tell Russ, okay, I get it. You were raised by wolves and shit, I understand, but this fur, this nonsense, the howling at the moon, is fucking creepy. Stop it, okay? It's not really how you act, is it? And I still believe that he basically thought, okay, I'm sure Lorgar will see the reason in this. When I bring him into the wider Imperium, he'll see technology, he'll see science, he'll see all the wonders of humanity, and slowly but surely, he'll get over all of this deity nonsense. But unfortunately, he didn't, which culminated in the rebuke in the dust of Monarchia. And he carries on with this idea throughout the conversation, essentially stating that what he did it all for the Emperor. Every bad thing he ever done, he did it for the Emperor. Every world brought to compliance, every world made to worship what is now apparently a false faith, he did it all for the Emperor. And therefore, it's none of his fault. He didn't do it. He didn't order any of this. He is not a soldier. He is a poet, a thinker. And when Magnus, even in the most careful, roundabout way, questions this, he responds once again with anger. Full-on anger, reaching for a weapon that isn't even there when he is with his closest brother. But Magnus manages to calm him down again, and Lorgar asks if there was talk of destroying the word-bearers like they did with the others, a reference to the lost Primarchs. We don't know anything about those, basically, and Games Workshop have essentially stated that we never will, which honestly I think is just fine, because at this point, the lost Primarchs and their warriors, they're such a mystery that they're much better as a mystery. I think that at this point, almost regardless of what explanation Games Workshop comes up with, it is going to be far more disappointing than having the mystery, so I'm entirely fine with that. And Magnus confirms this, that yes, there was talk about what to do with the word-bearers, and the Emperor approached his other sons to get their feedback. Magnus then says that he don't really know where most of the others stood, but he did know where Russ stood. You know, Magnus and Russ being best friends after all, so, you know, they probably discussed this. Yeah, I don't know how Magnus knows this, but it does give us an interesting bit of insight into Leman Russ as well. Russ is an incredibly fascinating character, because he presents himself as the savage, but it is clear he is sharp. He understands his role as the Emperor's executioner perfectly, even to the point of understanding just how much restraint such a role requires, and the simple fact that you do not wish to swing the axe if you can avoid doing so. And when the question comes up of whether or not the word-bearers should be taken care of, he argues against it, because that is his duty as the Emperor's executioner, to never question when the order comes, but to make sure that it is not ever necessary for it to actually arrive. And then we get to probably the single most interesting part of their conversation. Magnus points out that it looks as if Lorgar is desperately casting about for something to worship, something to place above himself. But Lorgar says, no. I'm not looking for a god in the primitive context of the world. I am looking for faith. And the reason why he's looking for faith is because faith itself. Faith, he says, was the single biggest unifying factor in human history, which is one of the largest crocs of shit I think I've ever read. Oh, come on. Anybody who has even the faintest knowledge about the history of religion will know that it is not one of unity. Religious conflict, religious arguments, religious discrimination, etc. Religion is only a unifying force for those within that religion who believe the same version of that religion that everybody else believes. If you were to adopt a slightly different interpretation, you're not quite so unified anymore. And the only way in which religion in and of itself could be a unifying force, the greatest in human history, would be if absolutely everybody agreed to the absolute, undisputable, unchangeable truth of the very same gospel, which, again, as we can see throughout human history, is simply just not the case. Now, we can excuse this to some degree by the simple fact that the Imperium doesn't know that much about ancient human history, but come on. I mean, hell, Lorgar himself burned a world and wiped out a religion because of another religion. Where was the unity in that faith, Lorgar? And hey, if Lorgar truly is just looking for faith, something to believe in as a unifying force, what the hell is his problem with the Imperial truth? It too is the exact same thing. It is an idea, a philosophy, and a framework to which everybody needs to agree, in this case, by Imperial decree. If Lorgar was truly looking for unity, unity of purpose, unity of goals, etc., then the Imperial truth would fulfill that in every way he wants. But that's not what he's looking for. And we know this because, one, he rejects the Imperial truth, he never even considers it, instead he clings to the idea of gods. And he tries to laugh it off, like, oh no, I don't believe in a mystical sky god, I'm not a fool, and then goes on to ask Magnus about godlike entities. Is there any creatures in the warp that may be considered gods by primitive civilizations? And when he questions the crusade, he does not question whether or not we are waging an immoral crusade, it is whether or not we are waging an unholy crusade. It is clear as day that Lorgar means gods as gods, faith as faith in a religious sense, and no matter how much he tries to change the meaning of his words, the meanings of those words in the context in which he is using them, and the actions that he is taking, makes the lies that lie within his words clear as day. And when Magnus tells him that this path leads to destruction, that if he carries on his pilgrimage, he will find nothing but misery, Lorgar simply just refuses to believe any of it. Lorgar's faith is blind. He will not entertain any alternatives, he will not consider that he is wrong, he is merely looking for something to worship, as will be demonstrated even more clearly later on. Now, granted, Magnus is hardly going about this in as finesseful a fashion as possible, simply teleporting away, telling Lorgar that he will find nothing but misery. He does not truly try to debate with Lorgar, or explain to him why he is wrong, but I also think that doing so would be essentially pointless. If Magnus were to show Lorgar a god of the Immaterium, Lorgar would declare that a god, undoubtedly, because Lorgar's definition of a god is simply something with sufficient power that is willing to be worshipped. And Magnus almost certainly knows that as well, but he could have tried to explain it a little bit more. Give him the whole spiel that Magnus himself believes that these entities are mindless creatures with no agenda or agency of their own beyond mindless predators. But he doesn't. And it makes both the Emperor and Magnus come across as very obtuse, as if they simply won't understand Lorgar's point of view. And it also makes it sound as if Lorgar's ideas here have merit. In reality, what Magnus should have said is, okay, so you view a god as nothing more than power, and as unity. Well, okay then. There are such creatures in the warp. You are correct. What you call a god does exist in the warp, but they exist in the exact same way that a gun does to a tribal savage. And just because the savage does not understand the gun, and the gun can be used against him, does not mean the gun is God, nor does it make the person who wields the gun a god. As you say, Lorgar, Father is psychic power made manifest, but that psychic power stems from the warp. He uses it as a gun, and you worship him because of that power. You are the savage, Lorgar, and until you recognize that, you will never break free from your self-imposed shackles. And speaking of torture, yeah, you know what's coming next. Right then. Was it a loud commercial perhaps? Something booming and bombastic? Something annoying for the sake of being annoying? I swear to God, I recently got a commercial for one of those online grocery thingies. You know, buy groceries here and you don't have to go to the store. And its point was, if you go to the store, you might run into somebody annoying who will annoy you in the store. A relative or an old nosy lady or something. And so this was replicating that event. A 3-minute long ad of an old noisy lady being old, noisy, and annoying. And this was supposed to endear me to this storefront. I swear to God, advertisement is getting worse and worse, but for the moment, that is still the primary reason to earn money on this fascinating little platform of ours. Speaking of annoying things, Magnus, deciding to leave Lorgar, he also chose to do in as annoying a way as possible, by activating his teleportation beacon and sending himself back up to orbit. This has a little bit of a side effect, although I don't think it's quite as devastating as the book makes it out to be. Of course, when Magnus disappears, then all of the area in which he was standing also disappears with him. Essentially, there will be a hollow spot in the air, which will cause a sonic boom as the air rushes in to close the gap. But in this particular case, him teleporting away blows up the top of this spire, which is a bit excessive. I don't think a teleportation flare in and of itself does that, unless Magnus teleported himself up to orbit using his psychic powers, I guess, which is possible. I mean, he can kill a titan by grimacing at it, so nothing is truly impossible in that regard. Though it does seem like an excessively cuntish way to leave a conversation. This is the next step in the no, fuck you, and then slamming the door type of exit. Except in this case, you slam the door and the door is literally the only thing left standing. And it is an interesting question, isn't it? What would have happened if Magnus had chosen to accompany Lorgar? I don't really think anything would have changed because, again, Lorgar's idea of a god is very specific. And there are certainly beings in the warp that fit that description, and I don't think Magnus would have been able to explain it to him in a way that he would accept and understand that these aren't gods. Especially, too, since Magnus does not possess the full picture, regardless of however much he is utterly and completely convinced that he does. But, on the other hand, say what you will about Magnus, Magnus was tricked into doing what he did. He was fooled. He was overconfident and arrogant. But he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. He didn't do this for any malicious reason, so I wonder if he would have allowed Lorgar to make the choices that he would eventually do, because they are of an entirely different moral aspect than the choices that Magnus did. Anywho, with the departure of Magnus the Red, we can move on to the next chapter. Lorgar has decided that he is going to try and dodge the attention of the Imperium just a little bit, and will join up with Argyltal's serrated sons away from the main expedition to try and get, Well, as much privacy as a Primarch under the direct supervision of the Adeptus Custodes ever could, I suppose. And before departing on the pilgrimage, he reads the future in the tarot cards, what was eventually to become known as the Emperor's Tarot. But in this age, apparently they are scorned. Magnus doesn't want them because he doesn't need them, and Russ don't want them because they're not his preferred foci. This tells us quite a lot about the Imperium right now, and also about Lorgar's view upon mortals. For whilst his brothers may not view this invention as particularly interesting or necessary, the rest of the Imperium most certainly will. The Emperor's Tarot, or Lorgar's Tarot if you wish, is a way for mere mortals, those with psychic powers, to read the future via cards cored with a psychoreactive liquid that will reshape themselves in certain patterns depending to some extent upon the wielder's own thoughts. Therefore, it will create a picture that that person is familiar with, although I suspect the pictures can still have multiple meanings. Perhaps even affected as much by the wielder's subconscious as the flow of reality and history. Lorgar begins to draw the cards, and the first one is a blazing torch carried in a strong hand. Lorgar interprets this as truth. Possible, certainly. But what else could it be? A blazing torch, fire, an instrument of destruction wielded by a strong arm. Incitement, rebellion, war. The next card is just as interesting. A cowled figure, Lorgar himself, reflected in the card, but the Lorgar in the card hides his face, looks away, and refuses to meet the gaze of the card's wielder. Lorgar believes this represents faith. It could also represent avoidance, shame, and subterfuge. The third card is that of a city, with towers and domes, and a sky distorted by a heat haze. Lorgar sees his home, Colchis, the city of grey flowers. But what other city of towers and domes was recently bathed beneath a sky, quivering with a sudden heat haze? Perhaps it is not the sun, but laser batteries that create that heat. This may not be Colchis. This may be Monarchia. In which case, this card, rather than saying home, probably would instead say judgment or consequences. The fourth card shows a winding path through a garden and a stone bridge. Lorgar interprets this as a pilgrimage, a journey. Lorgar compares this pilgrimage to the journeys of Odysseus in our own history, to the journeys of pilgrims like Khorne, Slaanesh, Nurgle, and Tzeentch, except with their names changed ever so infinitesimally little. And this card, this journey, surrounded as it is by lush gardens, may suggest that one could veer from the path if one were to choose so, but for Lorgar this is nothing but a path set in stone. A stone bridge. And finally, the Golden Lord. The Emperor. And Lorgar believed that this Golden Lord was the Emperor all the way up until the point where he no longer believed that he was the Golden Lord. And if no Golden Lord would arise to lead humanity down this path, then his dreams would be lies. There would be no truth to them, and that future would not come to pass. But of course, Lorgar's skin is also golden, and Colchisian legend spoke of a crude tear in reality, through which the breath of the gods flowed, the Immaterium, a realm that Lorgar thinks is paradise. Well, for some, I'm sure. And so what have we? We have rebellion, subterfuge, judgment, a set path, and a golden lord, with Aurelian's name, of course, meaning the golden one, the sun, the center, and so on. Lorgar sees in this an inevitable consequence, a future already set in stone, a path he must tread. What I see is a possible future, and I'm almost certain Magnus would have told him so as well. This is but one of a million possibilities, but once again Lorgar's interpretation of reality makes it virtually unescapable. Because Lorgar does not care about the consequences, he does not care about the costs, he does not care about the reality of the situation. He works on absolutes, and his absolute is faith. He keeps saying that he pursues faith, for without it humanity is lost. But that's a lie. He places faith far above humanity, as we will see. We also get an interesting little side chapter from Cyrene, which begins the theme that we're going to be seeing a lot more throughout the book, making the word-bearers look like the victims of consequence, rather than the creators of those very same consequences. She begins to speak about the truth, the primordial truth, and how the word-bearers were oh so sad that they had to bring this truth to the rest of the Imperium, for no other reason than because it is, quote-unquote, the truth. Oh, and speaking of truth and illumination and such things, so far I've been speaking of the events in chronological order as they appear in the book. I'm going to keep doing that in a slightly different way now that I'm going to be taking the events as they occurred in real time. So the book here skips over to one of those... I really hate it when books and movies do this, where they show you what happened, and then they work backwards from there. Because, I don't know, maybe some people like that. I get the shock value of like, how did they arrive at this? But for me, that's just like, oh, spoiler, this is how it ends. Fuck you. So, I'm going to take it in the chronological order rather than in the book's order. And the most interesting thing to start with is once again Incarnadine, the combat servitor serving alongside the word-bearers. As mentioned previously, it is a bit of a unique case in that it has been accepted into the Word-Bearers Legion as an honorary brother, to the point that Argel Tal, along with other warriors, come to administer its Oath of Moment before embarking upon a compliance. This honorary brotherhood has also resulted in the chapter's icon, the Serrated Sun, or Chaos Star if you wish, being placed upon the servitor's body. And according to Xenu, the tech adept who controls these servitors, ever since that happened, the machine has started acting out. It is able to recognize the members of the Word-Bearers Legion, even without any software, firmware, or wetware enabling it to do so. And even whilst in a dormant state, when the machine should be unable to do anything, its ocular implants focuses in on the word-bearers. Ever so minutely, granted, but not only should the robot not be able to do that, it shouldn't even be able to recognize them in the first place. And yet, it does. Xenu was so annoyed over this little glitch, as he calls it, that he took the ultimate step of flushing out the servitor's brain entirely. And with that I do mean, literally, the removal of the entire brain, which Xenu then painstakingly and slowly rebuilt from scratch, including all of the various connectors that allows the brain to communicate with the servitor's body. And yet, despite it having an entirely new brain, the flaw persisted, which utterly baffled Xenu, He had absolutely no idea whatsoever what could possibly be causing this. There should be no way for this to occur. And, naturally, it would never occur to Xenu, not even in his wildest dreams, that the reason for this glitch has nothing to do with the servitor whatsoever, but instead the chapter icon of the serrated sun. Poor little Xenu. He will have no idea what's wrong with his robot all the way up until it undoubtedly breaks his tiny little spine into small pieces and stomps all over it. It does tell us a few more interesting things, though. Xenu mentions that the wordbearers are not particularly happy with the Adeptus Mechanicus, which is interesting. He mentions that the wordbearer's relationship with the Mechanicus is on the cold side rather than the cordial. So that's a bit interesting, isn't it? The wordbearers are a religious legion. Or, well, we've called that into a bit of question throughout this video, but at the very least they believe in faith. They value faith. The Adeptus Mechanicus are the only openly religious order within the Imperium, although their religion is a bit different. They don't worship a god or a deity or saints or anything like that. They worship the machine spirit, which, well, basically it is a religion, but they've finessed it to the point where it is accepted within the Imperium as not a religion. A wee bit hypocritical, considering the censor that Lorgar received, to be sure, but, well, that's how it is. But you would think that the wordbearers would be very, very interested in this, or perhaps even that is the reason why their relationship is so cold. Well, it just, look, the Cog Boys, they get to have their religion, but we don't get to have ours? How is that fair? Possible. But still, you'd think they'd find some kind of common ground, we worship a thing, you worship a thing. We both have faith, but I could also imagine the Adeptus Mechanicus arguing that their faith isn't actually faith, but something else entirely connected to the machine spirit and so on, but now we're entering into some real theological nonsense here, so I don't know if there's really any correct answer, but you would still think that they would at least enter into some kind of dialogue, considering their particular proclivities. But further questions on that is going to have to wait until the next episode. I'm probably going to do those the next week because I'm barely halfway done and I don't think I can record these quickly enough, so I'll give myself a little bit of time and do 3 Horus Heresy episodes probably the next week as well. So until then, thank you very much for listening and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.